So, my presentation will now focus on the content analysis of our interviews. First, I will give a brief introduction to our methods and will then tell you something about how we created a coding guideline. This will be illustrated then by a glimpse into a case study. And I'll start with a quick overview of our methods. Our studies have always been conceptualized as multi-method studies. The aim of this triangulation is, on the one hand, to be able to look at a single case from different perspectives and thereby get a multidimensional image. But this approach also helps finding more general patterns and typologies. For the quantitative part, we have a comprehensive questionnaire which I can't explore any further here. The qualitative part consists of the structural analysis on the one hand, as introduced by Barbara in her presentation, and the interpretation of key aspects on the other. This approach is supported by the qualitative analysis software Atlas TI. It allows us to evaluate two levels of the interview text. The analysis of the content, that is what is being said, and the analysis of the narrative, that is how something is said. And Barbara has mentioned the narrative analysis in her presentation already, and this is something that can be done more systematically with the help of the software. To capture these levels, we created a coding guideline. In the process of developing this guideline, we coded several interviews with an open approach on the one hand, and some pre-constructed items on the other. Let us therefore now turn to our new method of qualitative analysis, which we call the coding guideline, and start with some methodological remarks. What we want to do with this methodical approach is capture biographical change and development in religion and spirituality, with regard to individual as well as intersubjective themes. There are already existing typologies and categories from our former research, and theoretical assumptions that help us understand faith development. One theoretical framework that we worked with, for example, was the narrative structure by Labov and Valetsky that you have seen in Barbara's presentation. However, we also wanted an open approach that allows us to navigate between interpretative openness and prior knowledge. This abductive form of logic will enable us to identify and further investigate categories and patterns that are already known, as well as discover something new. And by doing so, our new method makes it possible to tackle further questions, such as, how can we trace the diversity of faith development? How does religious or spiritual identity develop in the course of a lifetime, and what exactly is changing? And lastly, can our findings help create new typologies? The creation of the coding guideline consists of 5 steps, of which we have completed 2 so far. The first step was to create categories, which was a very open and unstructured process. In practical terms, this meant that we searched through our interview material for interesting or surprising aspects. The way in which we selected and combed through these first 8 interviews was informed by an open coding process and a theoretical sampling strategy. These are methodical approaches suggested by the grounded theory, which greatly influenced this first rough analysis. This open collection of observations was then the basis for the creation of the coding guideline in step 2. Successively, the vague categories were specified and their characteristics identified. You can sum up these first 2 steps of our approach with this little figure here. Noticing interesting things in the data when reading through the interview transcripts was the first step, of course. After a while, we noticed a few things which were similar to some we noticed before. So we tried to group codes, summarize them, and find other codes that fit into the same category. This could be summed up under collecting. Then, when noticing things, comparing nodes and codes, developing categories and subcategories, or finding patterns and relations, we discussed our ideas in group sessions. There, we brought together what everyone had done by herself which usually led to the conclusion that there were more things to notice, which started the process anew. So let us now have a look at that coding guideline in its current form. Here you can see parts of our coding guidelines. They each consist of a broad array of interdisciplinary concepts deriving either from literature or directly from our material. First, you can see the two separate coding lists. In course of the process described, the content level, that is the information on what is said, and the narrative level, which is the information on how it is said, were separated into distinct code lists. As a result, we now have two clearly identifiable systems of categories, along with their different characteristics, which can be coded directly in the interview material. The coding guidelines in their current form seem sufficiently saturated, since we haven't found significant new codes in the last few interviews we coded. Nevertheless, it is still possible to insert new themes and so on if they are found important enough in the process. Each coding guideline consists of a hierarchical structure of categories and their characteristics. As an example, I would like to concentrate on one category, in this case, the category relationships of the content code list. Here we can identify how interviewees characterize relations with different persons or groups, for example, the relationship with their parents. When we come to a more specified when we come across interview passages where this relationship is explained, we can code this with a more specified category or even a combination of categories, sometimes even contradicting ones. These are just some of the subcategories we found. In this case, I chose parents as perpetrators as an example because that subcategory appears in the case study as well. And these findings can also be combined with other categories from our coding guideline, providing us with a differentiated picture of the interviewee's accounts. For example, when looking at the category strangers, we have multiple options as well, such as these here. In the case that will follow, we will see an example of a xenophobic attitude towards strangers. And to illustrate this further, I would now like to give a brief insight into one of our case studies. Carola is a woman from Germany who we have interviewed 3 times so far. So here are her basic demographics. The most important marker event for this presentation is her retirement between the first and the second interview. What I would like to show here is how our coding process helped me come up with a surprising finding. First of all, Carola comes across as an intellectual woman, and she likes to talk about the books she has read. In the first interviews, for example, we have this quote. I have thought about God a lot. Do you know the book, God, a biography? Very interesting. In the second interview, there are more references to books and how important reading is for her. Like, when I read books like that, they enrich this part of my life. I don't know if you could call that spirituality. Or another quote. I read that book by Heinz Buschkowski, Neukölln is Everywhere. And when you read that book, you get really scared about how it's going to be. These are just 2 of many examples from her second interview. And remember that she retired shortly before the second interview, so that may be the reason why she now has time to read that much. Apparently, she even reads more by the time of the third interview. The first quote saying, I am really scared. Do you know that book by Michel Houellebecq, Submission? It describes how Islam gains control in France and how the population is subdued. The second quote, there is this development and it really has to do with the Islamic indoctrination. I have informed myself and read a lot. And lastly, there is this website, Einzelfälle.de. Go and have a look how many isolated incidents there are in this country. So what I found here is an indirect self-characterization. Instead of saying, I am smart, which would be kind of inappropriate, she refers to the smart books she has read. This was a phenomenon that was kind of new, meaning it had not appeared in the interviews we coded before this one. So let me show you how that would look like on the coding tree. Clearly, this should be something captured with a code from the category image of self. This contains multiple options, for example, these, which all did not quite fit to what Corolla is doing in her interviews. Therefore, I decided to create a new code and call it well read. But when I looked at the codes that I assigned, I found something else. I found that the code well read often coincided with another code. So let's take a look at her quotes again. And what I found kind of surprising was that the codes that I assigned to the passages where she talks about her reading often coincided with another code named xenophobia. And taking a closer look at the quotes, you see that the topic that she's interested in is clearly Islam and its influence in Europe. Further analysis showed that she derived most of her stance toward immigrants from right-wing populist literature, and adopted a vocabulary that is widely used among the extreme right, which was definitely not the case in her first interview. So Atlas TI helped me figure out that there was a connection between the code well read and the code xenophobia, which in my view sort of contradicts her attempt at characterizing herself as an intellectual. As a next step, this can be visualized by creating networks. For us, this is still work in progress, so what you will see in the next slide is an exploration of how these networks can be used. We can see here some of the codes that co-occurred with the code well read. The rectangles grouped around well read are codes from very different categories of our coding guideline. And as you can see, xenophobia and social criticism are strongest, but there are more topics like parents as perpetrators. So it becomes clear that Corolla tackles important topics in her life by reading relevant books. Moreover, you may come up with a finding that social criticism and xenophobia feed into each other in Corolla's argumentation. So on a methodical level, you can say working with these networks stimulates a different kind of thinking and allows further explorations. They can help you visualize ideas or for hypotheses you had when, for example, reading the interview. In the end, networks can also be used as a means of talking with others about a finding or about an idea to be developed. As a last remark, I would like to give you a short outlook into our next steps. Here again are the 5 steps of the working process that you've seen at the beginning of my presentation. Currently, we are working on step 3. This means that we are in the process of coding more interviews with the help of our guideline, keeping it open for new discoveries. In step 4, we will get a detailed overview after each interview in our sample has been coded. In this process, the coding guideline will be extensively tested, discussed, and refined. For a qualitative sample as large as ours, this is a major step because otherwise it is nearly impossible to get that overview. And in the last step, we'll be able to choose new case studies based on the reconstructed patterns made possible by the overview created in step 4. And, more importantly, this method will help us create typologies and get further insights into the development people go through in their lifetime. Thank you for listening.